So I'm really pleased to be able to talk to my friend and colleague, Alex Orfinger, the publisher of the Washington Business Journal, about how he and his organization are navigating through uh, a virtual world. So good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Liz. I'm so happy to be here with you as well.
Great. So Alex, I know that events have been a really important part of the Business Journal's connection and engagement with subscribers. Can you just talk a little bit about your strategy kind of pre-COVID around events?
I'd be happy to. It was always such an important part of what we did at the Business Journal, connecting people with one another to help not only build community, but also sort of central to what we do is to help our readers and help people that have a connection with the Business Journal grow their business and enhance their professional lives. And that one-on-one connection was sort of central to that, central to what we were all about.
So when COVID hit, and you do a lot of events, you have best real estate deals, 40 under 40, whatever. How did you adjust? What were some of the things that you started to think about now that you couldn't have those big gatherings like you typically would? How did you start thinking about them differently?
It's a great question. I'm not saying anything that so many other people haven't already said, but this was truly a black swan event. We were really focused on so much on diversifying our revenue streams as a news organization, to build up our subscriber base and also to build up our event business. And then all of a sudden, just in the second week in March, for it to just disappear out of the blue, really required some very quick thinking. So we very quickly pivoted to creating events that would be, sort of the moment and give people information they needed immediately. And so much of what they wanted was really connectivity with one another up front. So that was one of the things that we worked on really quickly, was to how do we actually connect people with one another in a digital environment. And I think even you were part of that initially, just like sort of just connecting people with each other up front. Then we looked very closely at all of our events. We have a series of content events, and we knew that people, since they were going to be sitting at home, were going to have they had a need for information. They had a need for information on how to really navigate through the business, sort of this pandemic and the upset to their business. So what do they need to do legally? What do they need to do HR wise? How are they going to address those issues? And then we really had to take a deep look at our events, our awards events, and how we were going to pivot those in 2020.
When you talked about creating connection, so what were some of the things that you did digitally to foster that kind of connection? Because people always say, it's so much better in person. So what were some of the things you did that kind of helped do that?
Well, very, very quickly, one of the things that I do is I'm the co-founder of a Business Journals Leadership Trust, which is a collection of CEOs, not only in Washington, but in 44 cities around the country. And within a couple of days of basically the economy shutting down, we brought people together in a setting like this in Zoom to just talk to one another. And there was this palpable emotion that you felt from people, where they really needed to talk about how they were navigating. They needed a safe space to talk to one another, to talk about the layoffs they were confronting, to talk about the cash crunch that people were facing, to talk about, so those were the immediate issues. And I remember the visceral emotion all across the country from people in the travel industry, people in the restaurant industry, people in the catering and event business about what they were going to do. That was sort of a central value that we could really lean into in that moment to help business leaders connect with each other, to help solve problems together. And that was a very important part early in the pandemic and the economic shutdown.
And did you have those meetings facilitated? I mean, how did you make sure that, when people kind of come on Zoom and you see the Hollywood squares and everybody just kind of stares at each other? So how did you foster that conversation? Because if people are talking about cash crunches and things that are concerning, how do you get them to open up?
So a couple of things. Great question. So first of all, you have to set some ground rules up front. You have to be very clear what the ground rules are. Number one, I'm coming in as a representative of a news organization, so I had to be very clear that this was off the record, that we weren't recording it, and that we really trying to foster a safe space. So it's about the words that I use, and about really asking people to be present, to have their cameras on, and to really share, to take their armor off is the expression I used to use. Let's be real here. That's what this is all about. And we need each other in this moment. So it was number one, ground rules. Number two is really to start any conversation and make sure everybody was talking. So even though many of us in these kinds of calls don't like it when we go around the Hollywood squares and ask people to introduce themselves, make sure that everybody's participating. And then as a moderator, you have to be very aggressive in shutting down people that overtalk,
Mhm.
overspeak. And it's not very comfortable. It's not very comfortable when you're sitting around a table of 8 or 10, in a ballroom to do that, to manage them. But you could sort of turn yourself away. But when you're on Zoom, as the moderator, as a facilitator, you have to just take a little bit more of an aggressive position on that. So that's a little bit. So that was the ground rules. And then I would always come to these sessions with 2 or 3 questions that I would pose, so that, again, you wanted to keep the conversation there. You also needed to, as the moderator, you needed to pay very close attention to people's body language on Zoom. I think we all have learned this also. You've got, like, somebody, those introverts out there, they're not going to interrupt. They're not going to jump in. So you have to pay attention to them. Liz, do you have a question? Do you want to jump in at this point? So that's what I have certainly learned, and I've done a much better job myself over these last 7 8 months to actually moderate a better room.
Right. So, about a month ago, I attended a fantastic Women Who Mean Business dinner, and that had 100 people. And somehow you managed to create a sense of intimacy that I didn't think was possible going to a large event like that. In fact, I had a lot of trepidation. Should I even go to this thing? You know, what do you think? How did you create that sense? I mean, it wasn't quite the same as being there in person, but it was pretty darn close for a virtual event. And can
Mhm.
you talk a little bit about the planning of that and how you kind of pulled that off?
Well, Liz, thanks for the compliment. It required some teamwork and some thinking about it on our own team. Um, that particular event is such a special event when we're in person. We've been doing it for 16 years, I think, and it's an extraordinary experience to sit in a room of our honorees and our alumni and get them to really sort of share and connect with each other. And they connect they were able to connect with each other in person in a way that held them together as a community of women business leaders. So how could we possibly recreate that? But that's what we attempted to do. So we really focus on that as the goal. So number one, um, we told everybody up front, this isn't just going to be another Zoom call. It's going to be something different. And we staged it differently. We got everybody dinner delivered. So they knew that it was something different than just a usual Zoom call. Um, so that was number one. Number two, we did a lot of planning about how to manage that Zoom room. We knew we were going to have a lot of people. So, our Zoom coordinator was working behind the scenes, and we practiced this a lot we had a pre-dinner planning meeting with all of our moderators, and we instructed them, you're going to be in these rooms and this is how we want the rooms to go. Introductions, we're going to have a question, and then we brought them back in to the common space and had some sharing there, which was a little chaotic, but because people jumped in, people had some stuff going in the chat, but it was a limited amount of time that they were going to do it, and then we're going to ship them out. So every woman knew that they were going to have an opportunity to meet 30 or 40 different people throughout the night. And I think that's what really made it special. It was tough. It wasn't like we didn't, I think the part of the secret of the success there, it was planning, it was thinking about what our purpose was. And it was also not taking it for granted that it could just happen on its own.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people come into these, "Oh, okay, we'll just throw people together and see what happens." And I don't think that works. I think you actually have to think about it, and you have to think about what you're trying to achieve that night or in that session.
Yeah, I thought that the idea of having a shared experience where we were all having dinner and there was you had your salad at the first breakout, which was it was sort of like table hopping.
Yeah.
In fact, you got to meet more people than you would have normally. Um, and how does and they each breakout or each table was there was a moderator, a facilitator. Was we weren't just left on our own,
Yes.
which was also really great.
So
Um,
so Liz, you should ask me what I would do differently if we had to do it again.
well, I was you beat me to it because I was going to say, what do you wish you had known? What would you do differently?
It's interesting. One of the things that a couple of women told me was they didn't quite know what to do with the food.
Mm,
Yep. Like, should I eat? Or is that rude? So there is a little bit of the food issue there about like what to actually do with it during that time. So I thought that was sort of like, okay, I need to be a little clearer about that. I actually sort of part of me, I had dinner delivered myself and I didn't actually eat at all because I just said I'll wait until after. I think there's also something about the time of day, which I'm not actually sure that that was the right time of day.
mm,
Um, I don't know. Frankly, I do not know what the right time of day is for gatherings. There's a little bit of the witching hour between 5 and 7, where people, because we're all at home, people are dealing with their families. They're all coming together for dinner and dealing with kids at home. So you know, in the real world, you know, we were able to manage this, but I don't know if that's the right time. So we're actually experimented last week, in fact, with moving an event to start at 4, with networking at 5, and then being done by 5 to 6. And that seemed to work differently. I'm
mhm,
not sure if that's the right time either, but
mm.
I think there's a time that, so the food and the timing issue are things that I would fiddle with a little bit and just think about.
It's interesting because a lot of people. I actually ate dinner because I read the thing before and it said, have your salad with the first table, the dinner with the second, and dessert. So I followed that and it worked really well. But I was the only person in my group eating, and
Mhm.
I think there's a sense that people don't like to eat on Zoom.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether they don't like seeing themselves eat and they find out that they have food hanging out of their mouths or what the
Yeah.
deal is. But that's an interesting
So,
point.
so I will tell you the other thing that I haven't figured out, and I'd love your thoughts on this too. When you're at this kind of a dinner in person, you not only are meeting with somebody, but you also have a real exchange of business cards. And I wish I had thought about how to do a virtual business card exchange. You know, you know, how do we actually do that digitally? And there's got to be some way of um, when I meet Liz Wainger, that I want to pass you my card, my information, either by chat or somehow. And I just haven't figured that out. And I think that's the piece that's missing from these experiences for all of us.
Yeah, probably the one way to think about it is to say, and we hope that you'll stay connected now that you've had a chance to meet each other, and either, you have at the afterwards. Again, it's a little bit more work. You send a list with some emails of everybody who was at that particular table, or you ask people at that moment to share their contact in the chat. But some people are less comfortable with the technology. And so, maybe,
Yeah.
sending it out afterwards,
Yeah.
it's not the same.
My hesitation on that is that we can't, for privacy reasons, we can't just share everybody's email addresses. They have to give us their permission. So I think we'd have to say in the meeting, hey, if you want us to share, why don't you put it in the chat and we'll share all of those emails with one another,
Mhm.
something like that. But that's part of the issue. I think I think that's the problem with some of these virtual meetings that I'm trying to sort of solve against.
Or another thought is when people register, they opt in
That's
to
correct.
sharing their email and say, and you can say, we're going to be providing digital business cards, and if you don't
Mhm.
want that, tell us. And
Yes.
that way you've done it at the beginning and you don't have to come back and compile and save the chat and figure out who said yes and who said no. And some people might have said yes, but they didn't realize they should have, so that's
Yeah.
another. But you're right. It's so these are interesting things. It's this idea of recreating what we're used to in person. How do you create similar types of experiences?
So, Liz, I do think, though, that it's important to remember that there's something on Zoom that actually works better than in person. And a couple of these examples. Number one is the ability to meet more people than just getting caught at a table of 10. In that environment, the example that we talked about, there was this opportunity to move around to a few different tables. So, okay, so you met more people. I also think there's this thing about not being, this thing we talked about that you can't really hide. You have to be present. So you're there. You can't just get lost. But I also think that there's, at least in my experience, and I may be wrong, I do think that people, when they're in a group that they really do care about, that has meaning, that it's not just like a pass through thing, that they are more present and more available, and they actually share more. I think there is this ability to have a more, everybody's dying for some intimacy, some connection, and I think that's what we tapped into at that event and last week's event as well. People really are struggling with isolation. So if you can create for them these moments where they actually can meet some new people and it's meaningful and it's not just like some random thing that happens, I think it really, addresses a moment that people are having right now. And that's what I'm really proud of, and what we're going to really work to do more and more of at Business Journal over these dark winter months.
Let's talk for a minute about revenue models, because obviously the standard revenue model of an in-person event, there's a sense somehow that if it's virtual, it shouldn't cost as much, or
Mhm.
even though in some cases it may cost more to prepare, or there are other costs that people don't realize. So how are you thinking about the revenue model for these virtual events versus the way you had thought about them before?
Yeah. So it's tricky. Okay. So I think number one, there is this. Um, there's an expectation um, that this should be a free thing that happens, and you know I actually have mixed feelings about it myself, to be honest with you. It's like, but then I kind of go back to the founding sin of the print media world, in the late 90s, early aughts, that we gave everything away for free. The Business Journal never did. We always had a premium wall that people had to pay for our content. And so I think that there's a little bit of that going on right now, that no, 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 no. We're not going to give you our content for free. You're going to have to pay for that in some way, some amount of money. And I think people are just, there is some issues around acceptance of that. So I think we're going to struggle with that. I think there's going to be some general sort of market struggle with that. We're going to try different things, but hopefully, so that's number one. The second piece is really our sponsor revenue, which is really like, how do you meet the needs of a sponsor in this environment where they feel that same thing about, wait a second, I'm missing something where I used to be able to connect with somebody in person. So it goes back to the same thing. Well, if I can connect you with more people, over the course of a night, of people that you actually do want to connect with in this intimate environment, that should solve to that. There's something that you also have to do as yourselves, you equally have to do, that you have to follow up. You have to do some additional things as a sponsoring organization. You would be doing those things in the real world anyway, but you have to have good follow-up mechanisms as well.
Mm.
And so you have to take those steps as a sponsoring organization. We have to help you do that. So the revenue model, again, when I look forward to a year from now, 2 years from now, I think we could be in a much more interesting place because I think there are going to continue to be virtual events that people will want to attend because it's much more efficient. Why do I have to go downtown to see a real estate panel discussion when I could just do that here or I could look at it on demand later on tonight?
Mhm.
So that's okay. However, I think that there will always be, people do want to come together for celebrations. I can't imagine that our best places to work where we get 700, 800 people in a room to celebrate companies and have their great workplaces, that we're not going to want to have a screaming moment like that because people love that. I mean, we love that. So I think there's this need to connect with one another. So I think we'll figure that out. I'm not, I'm not. I'm sort of excited by it. I think that this model change, this shaking it up a little bit. Yeah, I was a little bit like, oh gosh, how are we going to respond to that? But I'm super excited. I think it's going to lead to so much innovation. So many different things will come from this. 6 months, a year from now.
So, what's one thing that now, 9 months or so, 8 months into this pandemic, that you now know that you wish you'd known in the beginning?
Number one, that it was going to go on for a long time. I think there's just been this sudden realization, maybe not so sudden, the slow realization that what was 2 months has become 4 months, has become 8 months. It's going to become 12 months, and I think there's some things that I think I would have. It would have been better emotional preparation for all of us if we had known what this time frame would be. So that's number one. Number two, I probably would have moved faster on. We took a little bit of a pause on our events. In the first couple of weeks, I would have moved faster into the virtual space. We thought that things would be better in the fall, but they really weren't. So we sort of took a little bit of a pause on some of our larger events. I probably would have moved faster and just sort of done the virtually. Um, that's probably it. Um,
Yeah. Well, this is great. Is there anything else that you think that I didn't ask you about virtual events, or any advice that you'd give to other people as they're figuring out how to navigate through,
I
I
will
don't
tell
know
you.
whether they're communicating with employees or they're communicating with
Mhm.
external stakeholders, whatever.
Stay true to yourself. I keep stay true to your mission. It's a better way of saying it for business. You know, what we're about is helping people grow their businesses, connect with one another, advance their careers. We need to stay true to that we could do this in this virtual world, and we needed to figure out ways to help businesses do that. And again, for us, like I believe that the Washington Business Journal can play a very central role in helping businesses with the recovery. And I want to be able to look back a year from now and say that the Washington Business Journal was a central force in helping the local business community navigate through these difficult times and being a central force and source of intelligence to help individual businesses and business leaders um, recover from this economic downturn.
Wow, I think that's probably one of the most important things that you've said is about staying true to who you are, and then so it's not about how many events you do or how wonderful they are, but how you navigate in this world to fulfill your mission and to serve the people that you serve.
Thank you.
That's really great. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on navigating in a virtual world. I really
My
appreciate it.
pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sure.